have been a lot more than a couple of minutes. So thank you, Simon, for fixing those things. And thank you all for attending our 5th webinar in the series. So we've talked about why relationships are important, how relationships can be improved and managed in these virtual times, and then got into some reflection on self-leadership and leading others through this time. Just a reminder, that's the 3 of us, myself, Matthew, and Simon. And this is all to do with the whole concept that company has been stolen in a capitalist ideal around profit and loss. And we believe there's significantly more things to be thought of when you talk about a company, a charity, a business, that it's about togetherness, and it's about, from the original, breaking of bread together. So it's to look at the more holistic view of what makes a business successful. In terms of what we'll go through today, I'm going to hand over to Simon. Before I hand over to Simon, just to remind you all, there is the chat functionality. We will be using polls through, so we'd encourage you to both actively participate in the polls, and also if you have any thoughts, comments, questions through the course, please do type them. And at the end, we will customarily have a 10 or 15 minute question and answer session. So with no further ado, thanks all for attending, and I'll pass over to Simon.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And today we're going to talk you through how to get the conversation started in your organisation about what strong, healthy relationships look like. And that's not as easy maybe as you might think. And then Matthew will be taking us through how to measure the health of the relationships in your team. Is there a way you can measure that? Is there a way that you can actually determine whether your relationships are healthy or not? Then we'll be looking at how you analyse the results of those measurements, and then when you know what's wrong, how do you make it improvements and sustain momentum in the long term? And Andrew will be coming back on section 4 for us. So first of all, how do you get the conversation started? How do you raise awareness of how critical and important relationships are within the health of your organisation? Matthew last time talked to us about relational empathy, the ability to see the world through someone else's eyes. And it would be wrong of us to try and raise awareness of relationships and healthy relationships within our organizations without doing it relationally. So how do you do that relationally? So we might be passionate about stronger, healthier relationships, but is that how other people are seeing the world? What questions might they be asking that actually might be related to relationships, but they don't yet have the language to express it? So a colleague of yours might be thinking about how her relationships could be stronger in her team. So closely related, but she might not have thought about how you can strengthen those relationships and how you can measure them. But then someone else in your organization might be thinking about how your business can move more quickly and be more innovative, and you might not immediately think that that's related to relationships. So how do we get that conversation going with that third person about why relationships might help you move more quickly and be more innovative within your organization? So how to start the conversation? Well, first of all, knowing where people are at is really important. So asking yourself the question, what signs do you see of difficult relationships, of challenged relationships, and making a note of those and observing the dysfunctional organizational relationships, which are maybe stopping projects happening or enabling teams to be siloed and not interacting with one another. But not only from a negative perspective, what stories do you have within your organization of really strong and healthy relationships? Maybe you see a project that's really succeeded and been able to go more quickly than anywhere else because of the health of the relationships and the way that people are interacting together. And then thirdly, what current business needs require strengthened, healthy relationships? And we'll look at that in some detail on the next slide. So those are the what's. What signs do you see of challenge relationships? What stories do you see of strong relationships? And what current business needs? But then who else shares your passion and interest? Who else is thinking relationally and starting to talk about that? And where might you have an opportunity to demonstrate relational improvement? Maybe you run a team, maybe you're involved in a project and you can see how relational improvement will work there. So what, who, and where? But what about business needs? How do we start the conversation going with people who may not think about relationships and strengthening relationships as being increasing the performance of your business? Well, let's look at these 5 different factors. They may be asking the questions, how do we move more nimbly? A lot of people have been asking that as we've gone through coronavirus and have had to pivot our services, and some parts of the organization have pivoted really quickly, but others have been much more slowly. Or they may be asking, how do we better engage our staff? Actually, our staff seem disengaged. Or how do we build trust in our organization? Or how do we respond more effectively in a crisis? Or how do we increase staff well-being? So they may be the external top-level questions that are being asked. So if we think about how do we move more nimbly, well, actually McKinsey did a study that showed that having an active partnership ecosystem for your business increases the speed of pivoting. So they were showing actually that the relationships that you build in partnerships and building an ecosystem can help you move more quickly. I know that from disaster response around the world. When the Haiti earthquake hit in 2010, we managed to get water filtration systems and shelter materials onto the island of Haiti within 24 hours. And I had a business ring me and say, how did you manage to do that? How did you do that? We can't even get toys into our toy shop within 3 weeks from China. How did you manage to get that there in 24 hours? And fundamentally, it was because we spent 10 years building up the relationships of supply chain that enabled us to move really, really quickly, so that when we needed to move quickly, it was a quick phone call rather than a search in yellow pages for who could help us. And so the health of the relationship is vitally important in moving quickly. Oh, how do we better engage staff might be the question. And with that one, Gallup have shown that, you know, on their staff engagement survey, that actually the biggest indicator within that survey of whether staff are engaged is whether someone has a friend within the organization who they can talk to. So again, relationships key to staff engagement. Or with trust, we showed in a previous webinar 2 weeks ago how trust is built on credibility, reliability, but also empathy. And this was from Stephen Covey's work. So again, the ability to build relationships can build trust both in individuals, but also for the organization. How do you respond more effectively in a crisis? I've talked about Haiti there as an example of that. And then the Relationships Foundation did some work with thousands of schools that actually showed that a pupil's well-being was increased markedly through healthy relationships. They showed that if they had one strong peer-to-peer pupil relationship and one strong teacher relationship, that their sense of well-being was significantly increased. So we can start the conversation going, not through rocking up to a meeting and saying, I want to talk to you about relationships and how we measure them, but rather looking at the business needs and the business issues and starting a conversation about how healthy, stronger relationships might assist in working through those business issues. So we're going to do a quick poll. Which of these business needs would most benefit from a relational approach in your organization? So we're going to do a poll and we'll launch that. So here we go, and you should be able to see that now, and we'll give you a minute just to vote on that. You can vote on multiple of them, so you don't have just to vote on one, you can select several of them. So which of these businesses would most benefit from a relational approach in your organization? Agility, staff engagement, trust. Okay, that's about a third of you voted. That's brilliant. We'll just give you about another 30 seconds. Most of you have voted now, so just give you another 10 seconds, the remaining 4 or 5. Okay, we'll end the poll and we'll share the results with you. I mean, interestingly, increased creativity and innovation. People are saying that that would benefit from an increased relational approach, but also higher trust levels, increased agility, and higher staff engagement, getting some significant responses there. And if you think of others, then put those in the chat, and we'll pick up on those in the question and answer session as well. So that's how you might go about digging for relational needs within your business or within your charity. But sometimes it's not necessary to dig that far, because as Matthew showed last time, more and more businesses are starting to think in terms of responsible capitalism. And actually, the Certified B Corporation and People, Planet, Profit movements are starting to put onto the agenda of businesses generally, how do we have a more holistic set of measures that measure our relational capital? How can we do that? So you might find within your organization that your senior team or your board or your corporate social responsibility or HR functions or governance functions are starting to talk about that anyway. So you might have a more straightforward in than starting to talk about business needs. When Matthew and Andrew and I started to think about what are the topics within charities and non-profits that would allow us to have a conversation about relationships, we identified trust as the most significant one. And both Matthew and I have led significant sized NGOs in the UK for over a decade. And we were seeing within board members and senior teams that actually this issue of trust was very significant for them. So we've seen a diminishing in the public trust in charities. In fact, charities in general are less well trusted than the average woman or man in the street. So there is a trust agenda and conversation going on already at board level and senior teams within charities. And so we were able to unpack for them that actually trust is based on not only consistency and knowledge and expertise, but also on relationship, and demonstrate to them that actually in improving the quality and health of relationships, we could come to a place that would actually increase the level of trust within the organization, but also external to the organization as well. So just an example there of how you might start the conversation. I'm going to hand over to Matthew now, who's going to talk us through the different ways in which you can measure and then analyze relationships once you've started the conversation. So Matthew, over to you.
Thank you, Simon. So we're going to start by looking at how we measure the health of relationships. If we could keep moving, Simon, next chart.
Sorry. Yeah, there you go.
Great. So as I mentioned last time, we all know that we give attention to what we measure. And so often in our organizations, actually businesses and charities too, we focus just on the numbers, the financials. And there's more and more people saying that's kind of the problem. You know, we've got to look at other things. We've got to get intentional about measuring other stuff. And the economics of mutuality movement sort of talks about people, planet, and profit, and breaks people into the importance of focusing on human capital and social and relational capital, as well as environmental, natural capital, and financial capital. So we're going to be looking at social and relational capital. How do you measure that? Next chart, thank you. So last time we introduced 3 areas where we want to get intentional about assessing, reviewing, and measuring relationships. We talked about the foundations of great relationship around emotional intelligence. We talked about the context for great relationships using the relational proximity framework in those 5 areas. And we talked then about the marks of relationships, the things we would expect to see when relationships are going really well, drawing on Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions framework. So we're going to sort of use that. We've basically taken those 3 areas and we've taken those to construct a questionnaire. So our approach, this questionnaire approach, is basically building on methodologies that are pretty well established now in organizations both in the commercial and charitable sector. I guess one of the best known examples would be about staff engagement, where probably in the last 15 years, everybody has sort of jumped on this bandwagon that says we've got to understand, what really is it that helps staff to be really engaged in the organization we're in. That's become a hugely important thing that we now focus on. And Gallup have got these 12 statements that many of us now use, or variants of that, to keep a really tight pulse check on how engaged our staff are. So at TIFON, we used to do something like this every quarter in every part of the organization, just to keep a really tight view on how things are changing. And it was incredibly insightful and helped us to act and really almost respond in the moment to issues that were emerging around staff engagement. So we're taking a very similar approach to actually focusing on relational effectiveness, a questionnaire-based approach. So next, thank you. So our questionnaire, we have 22 questions or 22 statements in 2 sections. The first section asks members of our team to reflect on a series of questions that relates to the relational effectiveness of the team overall. So there's a series of questions, a series of statements which we put in front of people. But we also do something that is different from many of the questionnaire-based approaches. We also ask team members to respond to 7 questions that relate to their other members of the team, as shown in this, this particular image on the right. And so that gives us a chance to really look at quite a granular level in terms of interpersonal relationships within a team. So next, thank you. So using this survey approach, this questionnaire approach, we follow a 7-stage process with clients. And I will just very briefly outline some of these steps. So firstly, it's really important to brief the team. So if we're working with a team on this, it's vital that it's not just one person or the leader or whoever is the proponent of this. We've got to make sure the whole team understands the point of doing this and why we're doing it and why we're asking a question. So they're committed and engaged and understand. So when they do the survey, the questionnaire, they're doing it from the right mindset. And ideally linking back to that narrative that Simon highlighted at the beginning. There's real reasons to do this that are going to help us in our organizational effectiveness and performance. We then tailor the questions and the surveys so to the particular team, and we have the capacity to add a few, just to add a little bit of extra detail, but also to give insight where there are specific contextual issues that we need to explore. We conduct the survey, we then analyze the results, we then sit down and review the results with the team, which is really important. This is something we do together as a team. And then finally, the whole point of doing this is to make sure it leads to action and fruit. And then we encourage the team to develop a review progress where they basically do the survey again. And so you do it regularly and see what's changed and allow that then to drive continuous improvement. That overall process of doing it the first time, in our experience so far, I mean, it typically takes about 3 to 6 weeks, given the realities of getting the team together, of giving people time to respond to the survey and so on. Okay. Just a few points to make, sort of practical points to make around actually conducting a survey like this. The first thing is the responses are anonymous. So nobody within the team will know who said what. And I think that's vital to encourage sort of honesty and directness and people to be really upfront. There's also, we're acutely aware that in this age of raising up our game on data protection and GDPR and so on, we're very clear that this data, and we have a variety of processes to ensure confidentiality of data and the way we gather that data and then present it back. There's also something very important that our early runs of doing this that is highlighted is that we really want to place the emphasis not on where am I in all of this or who said that. The whole idea is to make this about relationships together. So the whole idea is how do we create collective, how do we improve collective team performance and within that, what is my contribution to improving relationships within this team? More of that in a moment. Okay, next chart. So just some example statements just to give you a flavor of the kind of questions we ask. So on the whole theme of foundations, which is really probing the emotional intelligence within the innate emotional intelligence within a team. Here are a couple of statements that we put out in the survey. I feel that team member X seeks out and values my perspective and contribution. Another one, colleague X is good at understanding and drawing out the viewpoint and opinions of other team members. So we're going to do a poll on one of those and just see, so with one colleague in mind, within the current team, think of the team that you're sort of most affiliate with, connect with. We want you to just sort of ask from your perspective, think of one individual and have a go at answering the question. How would you answer that question? From strongly agree to strongly disagree. Okay, just another few seconds. Okay, I think we'll pause there. Thank you. So again, I'm not going to comment on that because clearly this is just an exercise to get you thinking along the line of the question. But again, an interesting diversity of responses. So there's definitely would be something that as soon as you're not all aligned around strongly agree, as soon as there's a divergence of response, it's worth exploring and trying to get to the bottom of what's really going on here. More of that in a moment. So if we move to the second set of questions, are all around the context. So this is again, there are a number of contextual drivers that enable relationships to thrive or not. And we again use the relational proximity framework developed by the Relationships Foundation. A couple of example questions here that we have used in the questionnaire. Communication between team members is clear, direct, and transparent. There are no unspoken issues on this team. Another one, I'm empowered to speak, contribute, and act. In no way do I feel isolated or marginalized from the team's decision-making. Okay, we'll have another go at those. So again, same with your current team in mind. How would you respond to this question? I am empowered to speak, contribute, and act. In no way do I feel isolated or marginalized from the team's decision-making. Okay, a couple more seconds. See if anybody else wants to respond. Great, thank you. So strongly agree, and a few where this is more of an issue. So I suspect this group that we have on the call today is maybe slightly self-selecting and are more relationally aware. So I'd hope that generally we'd have more positive responses from you guys. But still, hopefully that gives you a flavor of the kind of questions we're asking. Okay, we'll move on to the next section. So again, this is now looking at the marks, the signs. So this is, if relationships really are thriving and working well, here are some of the marks that we'd look at in great relationships. So again, a couple of statements we look at. As team members, we're clear and committed to the decisions we make together, even when there are difficult discussions and opinions differ. Second one, significant disagreements and differences are surfaced, discussed, and resolved, regardless of how difficult the discussion. So again, let's have another go at that one.
Unfortunately, we don't have a poll for this one, Matthew. I've left this one out, so
okay,
we'll have to think about it.
Well, think about it. I'd love to have done this one because certainly in my experience, this is the one that we generally find harder and don't respond so well to. So that gives you a flavor of the kind of questions we ask in the survey. Okay. So we're now going to move to, okay, we've done this questionnaire. How do we actually move from a pile of data to actually creating real insights? So we're sitting down with a team now and saying, look, what is this data actually showing us? What I want to run you through is a series of charts in a moment that we use to try and drive insightful conversation with the clients and teams we work with. So critical here is it's a facilitated team workshop. So we need to sit with the team in a space where the space is safe and open and people are really able to engage and think creatively about the state of relationships within their team. As I've already said, we are using as much as possible familiar and proven frameworks where this is appropriate. Because I think then we're building off proven frameworks that people say, I've seen that elsewhere. Gosh, I'd never really seen it applied to relationships in this way before. So some of the ones we're using is emotional intelligence. Daniel Goleman, who again has written some fantastic books around this, and I think is seen as one of the leading sort of thought leaders in this area. The relational proximity framework, which we've touched on, the trust equation, I'll come to that in a moment, 5 dysfunctions of teams, and so on. The purpose of this workshop is really to get everybody to get deeper insight into the relational dynamics on the team. So to go beyond a sort of gut feeling about whether it's good or bad to actually some real insight about actually it's these 2 or 3 key areas that are really the things we need to focus on. And it's also practical and pragmatic. It's about actions. It's about continuous improvement. It's about actually doing something about this. So let me talk you through 6 charts that we focus on, that we really highlight, we're finding particularly helpful in driving these kinds of conversations. Firstly, overall trust levels. So here we use something called the trust equation, which is a framework that basically says trust has got a variety of factors. It's about credibility in the relationship. It's about reliability in the relationship. It's about the general relational proximity in the framework, but it's also about the social awareness, the innate empathy within this relationship. So we use this framework so that the questionnaire drives data in each of those 4 areas: credibility, reliability, relational proximity, and social awareness. And with that, within that, we can calculate a trust index out of 100. This chart shows the perspective of each team member. So we've got 8 members here, and they each give their view on the overall trust level in their team. When we engage with clients, we focus on the highs and lows. We try to understand what's going on when things are very high. What do we learn about that? But we also focus on the lows and trying to understand what's going on, and particularly unpacking which of those 4 factors was particularly the issue at play. We also compare with benchmarks. So as we're beginning to do this with more clients, we're developing benchmark data. We can then compare how this team compares to others, or even within an organization if this is being done more widely across a variety of teams in an organization. And of course, then we try to review this over time. Now, in this particular example, the things that's really worth highlighting out is, well, why do individuals 1 and 2 feel trust levels are lower? What's going on there? And this particular instance, that we were really focusing on aspects of social awareness. So it was really the social awareness factor, the empathy issue that was really at play here, as well as aspects of relational proximity. And the benchmarks was very interesting because that really helped to prompt the discussion that actually, gosh, you often when you throw out a benchmark to a team, it sort of drives that competitive instinct to say, well, why are we not as good as this individual? We've got to do something about that. So again, benchmark was very helpful in this particular instance to get some engagement around the importance of doing something about this. So the next chart looks at those relational proximity, those 5 drivers. So this is now we're very much looking at the context for fruitful relationships. So what this chart shows is the average perception across all team members across each of those 5 drivers of relational proximity. What we do here is we try and explore why certain drivers score high and why some score low. We try and get the team discussing, well, why? What's going on? What are the underlying issues here? And again, where there's variation across team members, so where there's a very high score or when there's a very low score, that's really worth understanding. And what's going on there? Why do some people have different perspectives on this? And it's also one of the wonderful things about this framework is because it breaks down relational context into 5 areas, it immediately generates 5 areas where we can get very pragmatic about how to improve relationships. And again, here we can review things over time. So in this particular instance, there's a couple of areas that were really worth exploring. The first is around knowledge, the middle one. What's going on there? Why is that score so low? And that led to sort of that would lead to very deliberate interventions that actually saying, well, actually, we need to find ways to increase people's knowledge of one another on this team beyond the immediate work environment. We actually need to create the context where we know more about one another in non-work environment, in home environments. What are our interests outside of work? What are the wider contextual issues that are affecting how I am engaging in the context of the workplace? We need to treat and respect people as whole human beings, not just as workers. The second thing we looked at was why was there such a divergence on fairness? What's going on there? Actually, overall, the score is pretty high, but actually there's huge disparity here on the way team members view their experience of fairness. And what we found here is that actually there was big discrepancies, that actually some people, 2 or 3 people in the team, felt that certain people on the team were sort of almost abusing or misusing status and authority within the team, and which led to some very practical, where actually those people, as soon as they realized that, they could change their behavior. The third chart we looked at was, the third framework we use is now looking at emotional intelligence. And this again shows the average perception of all team members across the overall team. And again, here we explore highs and lows and try to understand what's going on here. Again, comparing benchmarks are very useful here. In this particular instance, what we highlighted was low low self-awareness here. And the team focused on perceptions of self-awareness here. And what we discovered here is particularly around communication style. And in this area, what we focused on was just feedback. Actually learning to give and receive feedback to help draw out self-awareness and people's awareness of one another. The fourth chart we use is mapping the relational situation of individual team members. So here we have sorry, one second. We have a framework that allows us to basically across those 2 dimensions of emotional intelligence or foundations of good relationships and the context, relational proximity, just see where everybody in the team is. So each red dot corresponds to 1 team member. And the aspiration is, of course, to be on the top right with higher emotional intelligence and higher relational proximity. And again, the focus is on discerning overall patterns. We're not trying to say which spot am I or who's that or what's going on. We're trying to understand overall patterns and review it over time. Here, the interesting thing was that actually there was the whole overall team is fairly high on emotional intelligence, but there was one group, sort of a group of 4 people who really felt relationally not close. So there were contextual things that were making 4 individuals feel disconnected and not so relationally close and strong with the team, whilst 4 actually were feeling pretty good about themselves. And what you find here was those 4 in the top right quadrant actually were all co-located and had a strong working historical relationship, where the 4 others were newer, but also worked more remotely. And so the intervention was very much around, well, how can we overcome that by creating more connections to connect as a team? The fifth framework is another mapping tool where we look at the overall level of cohesion in the team, or the relational proximity in the team, and we also look at the level of challenge in the team. And broadly, there are 4 areas here. So ideally, we want to be in the top right. where we've got a very high level of cohesion in the team, but we've also got a very high level of challenge. Again, the red dots indicate people's view of the overall team. So each dot reflects an individual's perspective of the overall team. In this particular instance, what we find is a group, 5 out of 8 of the team, would say well, actually most people in this team, there's a lot of cohesion. So everybody's on the right-hand side of the chart. There's high level of cohesion in the team, but challenge is low. So something was going on in this team where people were just being terribly nice to one another, but weren't really facing into the real issues. And again, what we had to do here was take the team through some very practical training on conflict management. So how to do conflict really, really well, again, which we touched on the last webinar. The final chart looks at, again, we're now moving to the mark, so the actual signs. So this is using the 5 dysfunctions of team model of Lencioni. And again, 5 areas, 5 marks that we'd expect to see in high performing teams who've really got relationships sussed. And Lencioni talks about trust that leads to a good conflict, that leads to commitment, that leads to accountability, that leads to attention results. And there's definitely a sort of a movement in his model where you move from trust. If you get the bottom ones right, it leads to the top ones. And again, the chart shows average perceptions of all team members across the 5 marks. And again, we explore why are there highs and lows with the team. We focus where variation is high again. And again, we explore opportunities to improve in each area. And this particular instance, what we found again, it was very similar to the previous chart, as we have a team here where trust and vulnerability, sort of empathy is high on this team, but they've struggled to translate that into real conflict. They were nervous about it. It almost felt conflict was a bad thing. And so we never really got the real issues on the table, and people never felt safe enough to get into the tough conversations that often got a little bit heated because they didn't know how to do that. And again, what we were able to do in this particular, and what you're able to do in this instance, was teach people strategies to tackle conflict well. That actually means if once we'd done that and managed to get to the stage where we were really having the tough conversations well, what then happened was commitment began to go up, accountability and attention to results then followed. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an insight over the kinds of analysis that we're able to use and how we begin to use that to drive the right conversations within teams. I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who's going to take us through, okay, well, what do we do next? We've got some insights. Where do we take it next with the team?
There's always a so what, you know, you can analyze everything, but what does that actually practically mean? And to sort of simplify it so it's something a little bit memorable to us is to think of it as your relational fitness. So if you think of using that as a metaphor we'll draw through a plan for trying to become more relational and your team to become more relational. I think the first key point on relational fitness is what you are thinking about is how there are very different ways of doing things, be they gyms, as picture on the left, or the park run, the picture on the right. But if you want to be a complete athlete, you need to be looking at nutrition, you need to be training muscle groups, you need to be incredibly focused. There's a story of an English World Cup winner who was basically criticized by the English management and told if he could run if he ran on his arms rather than his legs, he'd probably be faster. And that was because he loved focusing on getting big biceps rather than the muscle that you need to solve the problems. So having that focus about what you're going to do to get your fitness right, be it running, be it weights, be it a sport, etc. So that's why we need to build a level of relational fitness with focus. So if we wanted to build that a little bit further, then is what are those actual muscles that you're going to be training in the gym? What are the sort of exercises you're going to do? And the key starting point is, there's just an example of a reasonably complex training program, is you've got to know your purpose. Are you going to be a sprinter? Are you going to be a marathon runner? Are you going to be an all-rounder? Are you going to participate in a specific sport? So you start by knowing your purpose. And then you get actually into what is the process of moving it forward. Again, we start with a health assessment, a fitness assessment, because that enables you to move from purpose into a vision setting. So you do a diagnostic in the fitness context. That could be bloods, it could be mobility, it could be strength, it could be speed, it could be power, or it could be all those into the wrap of what you're trying to achieve as a purpose. As we've touched before on self-management, your personal desires come into it. One of the reasons we use this metaphor, as Matthew and Simon constantly tease me incredibly, I actually own a gym. And one of the key things about the personal desires is, I hate animal movements, which are crawling around on the floor. And because I hate them, if someone tries to get me to do them, I won't do them. So you need to understand your personal desires, your biases, what's going to be effective to get the best out of you. Compare that with others, with benchmarks, map those commonalities and differences, and then you can get an alignment about where you're trying to get to and your best route of getting there. So I always think, for example, in a training regime, if you were in the gym, you should always start with squats or deadlifts because they're horrible. And if you put them at the end, you probably not do them. So it's thinking of your relationship management and building those muscles like a fitness. So that's your vision setting, is the first thing you do. And what that would be followed up then with things like one-to-one coaching. So now you know your plan, now you know what you need to be doing. You can have someone to take that through with you as a one-to-one coach. And then there's two types of group classes. Careful not to stretch the metaphor too far. An example I always remember was from years ago, was when talking to Toyota about their willingness to be open and share their manufacturing competencies with Ford. Weren't they afraid that whilst they might be 5 years ahead of Ford at the moment, that Ford would soon catch up and be level? And they whispered to themselves, and the translator came back and said, we are 5 years in front of Ford now. When Ford gets to where we are now, we will be 10 years in front of them. Now, you can argue there's a milder case of arrogance in that, but it's having those competition, understanding, learning, and being confident to be the best, to test yourself against the best. So those inter and intra, we mean things like peer groups in business, so people who are outside your sector, and then intra is when you're doing it with your team. Specific muscle groups, so you've got to be training for exactly what I said. So the example I gave earlier of the England rugby player, biceps are broadly known as beach weights, because whilst the biceps are useful muscle, if you're a rugby player, you've got to have the right level of muscle for the position you're actually playing. So you'd see these professional athletes with very clear programs focusing on their exact muscles. I'll skip through these. There's 3 quick slides. I think we're sending this out and you can have a look, but there's 3 technical competencies perhaps you can build there. One is, the first one is growing empathy. The second one then is managing conflict. Matthew's touched on this. For me, I think it's really critical and important. And it's probably, my perspective, would be one of the most neglected. Part of that is because the word conflict has negative connotations, whereas what we need to be thinking of it as, how do we together solve challenging problems in a trusting and manner for a win-win solution. So, you know, you've got to be thinking about what the exercise is. You've got to, deadlifts are hard, so you've got to do what perhaps you don't enjoy to get the real benefits. And then thirdly, obviously, listening is, am I really actively listening? Am I empathetic? Am I really trying to take part in this? Or am I a passenger focused on something else? So those are 3 specific training you might want to undergo. And finally, and critical to this, is the role of communication. You need to know who you're going to communicate to, but what you're going to communicate to that individual or group of individuals. Understand in their context what will motivate them, what will enable them, what will achieve the buy-in you're desirous of with them. And that kind of reflects into the very final one, which is, okay, that sounds great, but what does this actually look like? Well, it looks like this. So first you have a clarity of purpose. Then once you've got that, you can do your vision setting, so you've got something to work at. Once you've got something to work at, you can use these different techniques. You can do the specific skills of empathy, conflict, listening. You can do it in peer groups or with intra-team stuff. You can have one-to-one coaching for all individuals, some individuals. You can have a communication program, be it hierarchical and disseminating down, peer-to-peer, or 360 type feedback. That all coming together then in a communication plan that makes it work. And the one thing that I'd probably bring out that Matthew's already touched on is this whole measurement part. So why it's in a different color there, it's absolutely critical in this to be comparing yourself so it's improved. So it's not just a talking shop or a feel good. There will be actual benchmarks set in the vision, which will be measured and will feedback loop into ensuring it's an ongoing journey for you. Okay, so Simon, me?
I'm happy to do it, yeah. So,
okay.
Brilliant. So just to pick up on some of your questions on the chat, and do keep putting them in, that would be great, and we'll handle them as we go through. So Mark Handley asked this question, and maybe Matthew, you can pick this up. Have you used this material in teams with many nationalities, mixes of Western and Eastern, for example? So I know, Matthew, you ran Tier Fund for 10 years, but used to working across multiple cultures. How does this play out in teams that are globally focused or have different cultures and approaches, particularly in view of the questionnaire, I suppose? So, Matthew.
Excuse me. So I think, again, I've definitely asked lots of these questions and seen them used in international teams. So, for example, a lot of the questions we used at Tier Fund in our relational sort of staff engagement, actually, some of them was similar to this. We also used something called a team barometer, which was a way of asking a particular team to reflect on specific aspects of team effectiveness. But few of those actually went to sort of the core relational dynamics that are getting quite personal. And so that would be different. And again, the work we've done so far as WeAreCompany has still been very much UK focused. I think my view would be all of these questions can work in cross-cultural contexts, but some of them will require rephrasing or adapting so that people understand, so that we're taking into consideration specific contexts. So you may remember we said we need to tailor the questionnaire. I think that was sort of step 2 in my process. This is one of the areas that we need to think very thoughtfully about, making sure we ask questions in a way that is contextual to the culture. One of the biggest areas in some cross-cultural contexts is issues around perceptions of power and authority, and also questions around actually sharing openly issues around emotional intelligence and vulnerability, which is deeply challenging in some cultural contexts. And again, I think we'd have to factor that in. I think it's perfectly possible to do it, but it does require thought, would be my answer.
Brilliant, thank you, Matthew. So Rich Johnson has a question I'd like to pick up on. So practical question, given lockdown, how would you go about starting something intentional with a team that would have to do it over Zoom, given all the limitation that presents on how we can communicate holistically? So Andrew, do you want to have a go at that first, and then Matthew come in on it?
Yeah, I think there's 2 parts to it. It's it's not ideal to start it virtually, and I'd slightly go a little bit further, is what I'd be doing at the outset is saying, what are the things that can be effective over Zoom, and what are the things that really need to be done face-to-face? So if I gave managing conflict as an example, I would definitely be an advocate of that as a face-to-face. So I think my view would be, you can work out the plan for what you're going to do, but you might not, if the launch of it starts on Zoom, I would suggest you might not want to do that, because it's important to get it right. And I think we should remember, in these crazy times that we're in, all being well, the whole idea that we're always using Zoom is hopefully going to start to dissipate. But what it will mean is our face-to-face conversations will be more purposeful.
Matthew, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Rich, and a good challenge, especially if we should accept that remote working is going to be the new normal for many of us. I think the first thing is, in the current environment, I think there's the whole section that Simon introduced about creating the narrative. And again, us getting agreement on how do we create the narrative that says why this is important in a way that leads to real benefit and value for our charity or for our business, that we can get on and start doing now. And there are a variety of ways we can get that conversation, almost as to get everybody's enthusiastic about wanting to do this. That can be done now. Yeah. I think the second thought is, and it's a good challenge, that actually for people who are working in remote teams, how do we do this? And I think there it probably is just as Andrew has said, a lot of this can be done remotely, but I think at some point, especially when you have that conversation, when you sit down with the results, the power of face-to-face and creating that safe space with good facilitation and reading all of the non-verbal cues that are going on is really, really valuable. And I think that will always be my preference if we can do that. But again, as Andrew said, lots of preparation can be done. And so you just use that time when you do come face together brilliantly.
Yeah. Wonderful. And Charlie asked this question: what is the most common resistance you encounter in communicating this important work? Matthew, what's the most common resistance?
I would say probably two or three things. So the first thing is, we're all terribly good at relationships already. We're all very nice to one another. What's the problem? Our intuitive sense is, we're good at this. It's kind of a fluffy thing, and we do it well. And I think actually that's why data is so powerful here, because when you come face to face with data, you suddenly realize the data is only designed to get you thinking. It's like a slap in the face that shows you what's really going on and gets you thinking. So that's the first thing, is people just think we're good at this, and actually they're often not. I think the second thing is we're too busy. And I think there are just so many other things going on. This just feels like a nice to have that we'll do at some point. And I think the key there is Simon's whole section, that people just haven't made the connection between the power of good relationships and charitable performance, business performance. And that's why Simon's section on creating this narrative is so key here, because it's making the logical argument that demonstrates the power of relationships to drive organizational effectiveness and fruitfulness, and helping people to see that and to construct that and to connect with that story themselves. I'd say those are the two things I'd really focus on.
And I'd agree with Matthew that actually turning it from something fluffy into something measurable and concrete really helps overcome the resistance. So generally it is, seen as a soft skill, and actually bringing some real data to that. And a number of you have commented on that on the chat as well. Just one last question. As Richard Goff asks, how much do you think teams can change their relational approach? And how much do you think this is a case of recruiting the right people to be in the team? So Andrew, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to it. Is One is you've got your current state, i.e. this is the team I have today, and they can change, but you need to go through this process to understand how far they can change and how you can make it work. But the second part is you should be relational then in your recruiting process as well. So in looking at the type of skills, you should be thinking more than just the technical part. So for example, this is actually genuinely true. When I was in KPMG, I set up our assessment center for management consultants, and there were 4 core metrics we tried to measure in those assessment center. And I think Martin Bull's on the call, so you'll remember this. It was knowledge, intellect, relationships, and I've forgotten the 4th now. Critical problem solving. But what was important in that was one of our 4 was ability to have relationships. And I can tell you as well, categorically, that was the hardest to measure. That was a few years ago. So hopefully if I was in that situation now, I'd have much better exercises to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, everyone. Some great questions on there, and far too many that we could deal with right now. But Matthew's just going to unpack for us what's going to happen next, and hopefully that'll be helpful for you in delving deeper into some of the real questions that have been provoked by this presentation. So, Matthew.
Great. So, sorry, one second. Sorry, I've got a... don't worry. So we've got the, we're going to have a final webinar in a couple of weeks' time on the 28th of May. Now, the whole idea here is to make this more of an interactive workshop to help each of you in your specific context figure out how can you get started on this agenda in your context. We really want to focus on the issues you're facing in making progress here. In making a relational agenda real in your team and in your organization. And so to do this, we really would value your input to help us focus on what would most help you in your context. What we're planning to do is to get in touch with you via email and just to try with a few simple questions, which would really value your response to, really just asking you to really highlight what are the biggest issues you are grappling with, in many ways the same questions you've just been asking us, and then specifically what topics would most help you in terms of getting practical and taking things forward. So that's what we're going to follow up with you, and again, if you could respond to that email, let us know. That'll then help us shape an agenda at this next workshop that is very practical and hopefully very geared to helping you take action in your specific context. In the meantime, do continue to check out our resources, particularly some of the webinars that have already happened. So for example, last week's week 3 and week 4, where some of the issues that people have been asking today, we actually have tackled that very explicitly. So do go back and have a look, as well as some of the blogs we've been putting up to go into some of the specific issues in more detail. Great, thank you so much for joining, everybody. It's been terrific to be able to share some of this thinking with you. Thank you for your comments and your questions. And again, we really look forward to continuing the conversation with you over the coming weeks and in a couple of weeks at the final webinar. Thank you, everybody.